So it is a pleasure for us to have today in our Bar Ilan University Vision Science Seminar, Professor Aya Ben-Yakov from the LSEC Center at the University, at the Hebrew University. Dr. Ben-Yakov did her BSc in Computer Science and Cognition at the Hebrew University. She then continued to do her PhD at the Weizmann Institute under the supervision of Professor Yadin Dudai, and then continued to do a postdoc at the University of Cambridge with Professor Rick Henson, where she was also a Royal Society Dorothy Hodgkin Fellow. After her postdoc, she opened her lab, the ABY Human Memory Lab, at the Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Brain Sciences at the Hebrew University. She publishes in top leading journals as Journal of Neuroscience, Journal of Experimental Psychology General, Psychonomic Bulletin and Review, and more. She's the recipient of the Israeli National Postdoc Award for Advancing Women in Science and also the winner of the prestigious ERC Stardy Grant. She investigates the building blocks of human episodic memory, including how real-life experiences transformed into discrete memories and how those memories are stored and retrieved. To answer these questions, her lab uses a range of naturalistic stimuli as movies and animations, combining behavioral and brain imaging methods to reveal how continuous real-life experience is transformed into discrete events. And she investigates how memory, how these illuminate the underpinning of memory formation and organization in healthy individuals. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you, Aya, to our seminar to hear about your exciting research, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and to talk about a new project, very different from the field and type of research that you mentioned. I want to start out by mentioning that this is a registered report. And kind of in line with the spirit of registered reports, the talk is going to be a bit different from talks that we often give in here. So I think we usually have these nicely wrapped up projects, these nice stories. And I'm going to talk about all the messy bits as well. And before I start, I should say that the credit goes to Shira Boror, a very talented postdoc in the lab who just finished. And I'd like to start with a very short introduction of Shira and myself. So probably a lot of you know that situation where a postdoc comes from a very different field and suddenly they have a very creative idea of how to bridge the two different fields. And I was very fortunate to have this experience with Shira. So this is Shira, according to AI, and she comes from the field of perception. Whereas this is a very, non-similar version of AI of me. I come from the field of memory, completely different. And in the field of perception, Shira mentioned these recent studies of continuity, where a typical sentence one could find in an introduction could be that our visual input about the world is noisy and discontinuous, but we experience it as stable and continuous. And a lot of research goes into this part of continuity, how we maintain continuity despite changes in the environment. And that's a bit funny because if you look at a typical sentence in an introduction in the field of memory, at least specifically looking at segmentation, you may encounter sentences like this, that our everyday experience is continuous, but we naturally segment it into discrete events. So how can these two things exist? They kind of existed independently in different fields of research, but just looking at how they exist in life, they could, of course, be at completely different levels. But there's this nice demonstration from The Lion King that I think shows how experience can be continuous and discontinuous at the same time. And you can really feel how both processes are occurring here, things that cause you to properly experience this as continuous, but also as being built of distinct events. Um, so I'd like to start with introducing a bit of relevant background in each of the fields separately, and then see how we try to bridge them. Starting with continuity, and this will probably be more familiar to the audience of this seminar, but I'll still have kind of go over the basics. So, how do we maintain continuity in the face of change? Um, Recently, there have been a lot of studies, a lot of interest in serial dependence. So, if we have let's say, a paradigm where we have a stimulus at a certain orientation, and then we have some orientation bar where we have to indicate the orientation of the preceding stimulus. These aren't usually bars, but let's say gabors. And then we have another trial. We have multiple trials like this. Then this initial finding from 2014 that has then been studied a lot is that we'll see that our response, do you see my mouse, by the way? Our response here is attracted towards the previous stimulus. So if the previous stimulus was negative, it'll attract our response. And then later studies also showed um, that our response is also attracted towards the previous response, not just the previous stimulus. So a bit of recap for those less familiar with this, how serial dependence is assessed. Um, so for each trial, we'll have the error of the current trial uh, based on the relative orientation of the previous trial. So let's say the previous trial, we had something at -40, the current trial at -10. That means the relative orientation of the previous trial would be -30. So here on the x-axis. And then let's say we responded -20, that's an error of -10. That would be -10 on the y-axis. And we can assess this, the error in two ways. We can either look at the absolute error, where we'll flip the direction of the negative errors. Anything in the direction of the previous stimulus will be considered positive. Or we can fit this function, this derivative of a Gaussian, to the data, because this is the shape that's usually received, and look at the amplitude. And we'll be looking at both measures, but we'll be focusing on the derivative of the Gaussian for the purpose of this talk. That's where we find the interesting results. So what's the function? I think one of the biggest questions is, what's the function of serial dependence, right? So let's say I show you these images of a chair. You'll probably experience them as a chair that's moving. And of course, there's plenty of studies of object constancy, but in general, this has been suggested as a function of serial dependence, that we expect the next moment to be similar to the current one, right? We expect things to stay the same. And then if we kind of smooth or average the incoming input, biasing each one towards the previous one, that's one of the ways we can maintain the sense of continuity despite changes. And one of the main questions is, what happens if the stimulus suddenly changes? So this should only be beneficial when we expect the next moment to be the same. So for example, if we now switch to a different chair, a different location, we may expect serial dependence to be reduced. And one initial indication of this is that people tend to find that you'll see serial dependence if an object is in the same location as the previous trial. But the findings regarding this question of whether serial dependence will be stronger for similar stimuli, the results are a bit mixed. And I'll give examples of two studies. So in this study, participants viewed circles of colored dots moving in different directions. This is one pair of experiments. They had an additional pair of experiments. Here you see these two circles of moving dots in different colors, followed by a mask. And then in one experiment, the cue was color-based. So the cue was either red or green to tell them which circle they had to report. And in the other experiment, it was a separate experiment with same stimuli. The cue was spatial position. Should they report the left or the right? Here in this study, they treat the direction of the stimulus of the dots as a content and the color as a context. In the world I come from, the color here would be more a feature of the stimulus itself, and context would be something more external. So our interpretation of this is a bit different. Um, and I should mention that they do have this other pair of studies where they had serial position rather than spatial position. But the interesting question here is whether you see a decrease in serial dependence when what they would call context, I'd call a feature of the stimulus changes. And this is not the results. This is a schematic depiction of the results using their actual amplitudes, just to make it easier to see. So in experiment 3, where the color was the cue, if trial X plus 1 was a different color than trial X, there was no serial dependence. Okay, so you'd only see serial dependence if it's the same color object. On the other hand, if the color is irrelevant, if we're looking at experiment 4, then you see no effect of color. Spatial, and it's the same for serial position. Spatial position, you see a reduction either way. So we see some complex picture. We're not going to try and reach a conclusion based on current studies. Just we see there's some complex relationship between having stimuli stay the same and how that affects serial dependence. Another study shows quite different results where in the study, there were stimuli followed by a mask and then reporting of orientation. But in one of the blocks, they had a block of mixed stimuli. So the stimuli weren't even from the same world. You'd have one gabor and then dots. And when they looked at these blocks, you see here that you see serial dependence for the gabors in gray, and you see serial dependence for blocks only of the dots. And when you have mixed stimuli, you still see the serial dependence between the different types of stimuli, even though you don't expect them to necessarily be related to one another. This is just looking at the overall bias. The important point here is that there's no real difference between only dots or mixed. So overall, the results from this are quite mixed, and it's not clear when we expect serial dependence to be stronger versus weaker. And for now, I'm leaving you with that question and switching quite abruptly to segmentation. This perhaps is a bit less kind of the bread and butter of the people at the seminar. So I want to start with just describing the basic terms that we use and what we mean. A very kind of influential theory in the past years has been event segmentation theory that both shows in various ways and discusses kind of theoretically that people naturally segment experience into discrete events. And to give you a demonstration of what I mean, you'll see this excerpt. They'll be talking, but there's no sound from Pyman. And try to notice when you'd say that one part of this is over. Some people may say here, one part of this is over and something new is occurring. Okay, so this whole thing is continuous. In fact, the whole film is continuous. But many people would say that there is a transition from one unit to another when she enters the picture. Okay, because a new character has arrived. This tells us it's a new situation. And these moments in time are called event boundaries. They divide our experience into events so that we treat what happened before as one event and what happened later as another event. So what happens at these event boundaries? Let's say we're watching this video. We assume they're going to continue talking. Next moment, we assume they're going to continue talking, but then someone enters, right? That's something we weren't expecting. So these boundaries, these moments in time are characterized by prediction error. That's something unexpected, often by sensory change and increased uncertainty. Our priors regarding what's about to happen are probably less relevant, and maybe we need to kind of bring new ones from memory based on our interpretation of what situation we're in now. So how do we measure this? These boundaries have been studied in a large range of stimuli, from very simple objects or elements to full-length films. But there are a few phenomena that are very ubiquitous that we often see at moments of boundaries. And I'll give an example from a specific study. In the study, they showed pictures of objects, grayscale objects. There were sequences of 6 objects, and each object was surrounded by a colored frame. After 6 objects, the color of the frame changed, and this was considered a boundary. And they tested here 2 measures of memory. One is associative memory. For the shovel, they'd ask whether it was surrounded by a purple frame or an orange frame. And this is a boundary item, the shovel, because it was at the moment in time where there was a change. And they're comparing memory for boundary versus non-boundary trials. This is one measure. A second measure they're going to be looking at is temporal order memory. So they're taking pairs of objects. Here is a pair of objects that straddle a boundary. There's a boundary in the middle. And here is a pair of objects that don't have a boundary in the middle. And they're asking which came first. And the findings in this study and others are that for associative memory, there's stronger associative memory at items that appear at a boundary. For temporal order memory, it's the opposite. We expect to see reduced memory for the order when there is a boundary in the middle. And this is something that really replicates across numerous studies. It may feel counterintuitive. I know it was to me, but this really is a strong finding. So these are taken as indices or characteristics of segmentation, that if we can either ask someone whether they experience the boundary or see whether we have increased associative memory and reduced temporal order memory. Okay, so we have these 2 completely unrelated things. How are they related, and why am I putting them together in this same talk? And I think the chair somehow demonstrates this, because if we think about the chair, right, we're imagining what's going to happen. We're making some prediction at every moment in time with the chair until we have some boundary due to this sensory change or prediction error. And perhaps we'd expect there to be reduced serial dependence at these event boundaries. If we think of the function of serial dependence, if it's supposed to induce the sense of continuity when we expect things to be the same, event boundaries are exactly those moments in time that tell us now something new is happening. You shouldn't expect the future to be like the past. So it makes sense to have less serial dependence at these points in time. So this was our first big question, to just see whether event boundaries reduce serial dependence. It was not clear based on the literature, because these hadn't really been connected. And then if we do see that there is reduced serial dependence, we can take this a step further and ask whether these are 2 independent processes. Maybe boundaries are related to segmentation, and by chance at the same time, we also have reduced continuity. So we have increase in these segmentation measures and a decrease in continuity. Or perhaps we have some shared latent cause. I won't say mechanism because we're not looking at mechanism, but perhaps when one goes up, one goes down. And for those not familiar with push me pull yous, I recommend brushing up on your Dr. Doolittle. And this is what we set out to explore. But we had a bit of a problem. Paradigms are completely different. Even if we take the simplest paradigms for boundaries, not full-length films, they're still very different from the serial dependence paradigms. So in a typical serial dependence paradigm, usually we'll have brief stimuli, often masked. They're often unmeaningful, although there are some meaningful stimuli, and we have this intervening task typically. Whereas for the segmentation paradigms, we have the stimuli presented much longer, no masking, no pause between the stimuli. The stimuli are usually meaningful, and we don't have an intervening task. So we had these 2 different types of paradigms, and Mo Coyne and Ufal Haik, two undergraduate students in the lab, were given the task of managing to combine these into something that will work for both. And so it was mainly Shira with their help. She found a lot of stimuli that were elongated, so we could rotate them. And then we presented them at different orientations and gave a serial dependence task. So there was no masking, but we did have the self-paced serial dependence task or orientation task to test serial dependence. And we tested associative memory and temporal order memory, just as in the study I described with boundaries. So as a first step, we needed to just verify we could find everything in the same paradigm. And for this, we ran a pilot and we wanted to see if we found both serial dependence and indices of segmentation. So in terms of serial dependence, we found very, very strong serial dependence, both towards this previous stimulus and to the previous response. This is just in general, ignoring boundaries, ignoring anything, just seeing whether we have serial dependence. It's certainly there. For segmentation, we found a very strong associative memory effect. The temporal order memory effect, not so much. We had contingencies in case this wouldn't pan out in the experiments, but in the end, in the actual experiments, we found it. So I'm setting that aside. So this pilot was used to kind of verify the paradigm. And now we're finally getting to the question that's really interesting to us. Is serial dependence reduced at boundaries? So the reason we submitted this registered report is that the pilot showed that it does. And if we could look here at the amplitude of the response at non-boundaries, which we take as this kind of baseline, you see that the amplitude of this derivative of the Gaussian for boundary trials is significantly lower. This is specific to the previous relative response. I'm going to be focusing on relative response. The previous relative orientation was less clear. The results there are more mixed. So now we ran 3 different experiments. I'll describe the differences a bit in more detail a bit later on, but they all had the same basic format. When we aggregate data from all of them, each having 272 participants, we see this effect. It's not as strong as we expected based on the pilot, but we still see the significant reduction in serial dependence in the blue compared to the non-boundary trials in orange. Looking per experiment, we do see this in both experiment 2 and 3. I'm not sure why in experiment 1 we don't see that. That's why there's an asterisk in the title. So overall, I do think this phenomenon exists. It seems to be not very strong, and it's an interesting follow-up question to understand why and when it exists and when it doesn't. Does it have to do with specific participants, things like that? But overall, for me, this is convincing enough to conclude that at least, well, maybe tentatively conclude that boundaries reduce serial dependence. But we want to go beyond just saying, okay, boundaries reduce serial dependence and boundaries lead to these segmentation effects. If we want to try and ask whether they're linked, we need to go further. And we did 2 things for this. One is studies 2 and 3 that I'll describe now in detail that look at different context manipulations to see how different context manipulations, first of all, modulate serial dependence and the segmentation measures independently, because each of those questions was of interest in itself, and then whether they modulate them in the same way to see whether there's a stronger link between the two. And second was looking at covariation of effects across different boundary transitions, across subjects, and things like that. And I'll start with the experiment looking at boundary strength. So now we have these different events like we had before with the different colors. Each circle here now represents the whole trial. Okay, it's an object at a certain orientation, fixation, orientation task, and another fixation. And we chose the colors carefully so we'd have weak boundaries. where the transitions were between similar colors. And we'd have strong boundaries where the transitions were always between different colors. And the question was whether boundary strength uh, mo kind of modulates serial dependence. And these indices of segmentation, it sounds kind of something that would have been asked by now, but there aren't really too many studies looking at how boundary strength affects segmentation. And we got what's, I think, the most surprising finding, and that's that we have a U shape for serial dependence. We expected either weak boundaries and strong boundaries to be similar and reduced compared to non-boundaries, or to see some gradual decrease. But instead, we have a significant decrease in serial dependence at weak boundaries compared to strong boundaries and non-boundaries. We think this could be related to attention somehow, that they're putting more effort into identifying these weak transitions. I'm very happy afterwards to hear thoughts regarding this finding, but this is what we get. In terms of associative memory, there's no difference between strong and weak boundaries, and they're both higher than non-boundaries. So it's more of a binary effect. For temporal order memory, we see a more graded effect, so that there's strongest temporal order memory. It's a bit difficult to see in this plot, but strongest temporal order memory for across strong, then across weak, and then within. Although the opposite, the strongest, of course, for within, but we don't see any significant difference between each pair. So in terms of the links between serial dependence and associative memory, it certainly doesn't seem to be similar to any index of segmentation. And it's also interesting that these two indices of segmentation are different from one another. And so that looked at boundary strength. And now what to me is the most interesting study that tried to dissociate boundaryness and sensory change, because usually a boundary will occur when we have sensory change. And so we trained participants quite a bit on these events. We had single color events and alternating events, and they were familiarized with the names of these events that were related to the colors and trained on identifying when an event changed. And then what we got is that we now have these different events that, first of all, within an event, we can have or not have sensory change. And also we can have a change boundary, which is a typical boundary, but also a boundary that's signaled by the fact that we don't have sensory change. And now I can ask, is it the fact that there is a boundary that affects serial dependence and segmentation, or the fact that there is sensory change? So in terms of serial dependence, we see a significant main effect of boundary, and we don't see a significant main effect of change. So it's actually, just looking at the statistics, it's actually boundaries that reduce serial dependence rather than sensory change, which is quite surprising if we think of serial dependence as a more perceptual phenomenon. And it goes together with studies viewing serial dependence as being not so strictly perceptual. I don't want to claim that there's no effect of change, because despite the fact that there's no interaction, if we look at specific t-tests, if we take the non-boundary, no change as the reference, when we just have the same color frame and it's not a boundary, we see that if we do have a sensory change within an event, that does reduce serial dependence. And similarly, if we have a boundary with no sensory change, that in itself also reduces serial dependence. So if we have either a boundary or sensory change, that reduces serial dependence, and but the boundary effect is a bit stronger. Looking at the memory effects, we now find that associative memory, which is considered related to boundaries, is actually related to sensory change. There's no effect of boundaries It's just sensory change, at least in this study. And if we look at temporal order memory, that's related only to boundaries and not to sensory change. So we see this nice dissociation also within this field of event segmentation. So these are the different studies looking at various manipulations. We did also look at covariation of the measures. Just from this, it's quite clear that they're not two sides of the same thing, but that's what we have when we have registered reports, right? So we are looking nonetheless at the correlations. We have no correlation between the boundary, the serodependence boundary effect and associative boundary effect. We have no correlation between the serodependence and the temporal order boundary effect. And interestingly, we have no correlation between the associative memory boundary effect and the temporal memory boundary effect. And before I summarize, just maybe an interesting tidbit. It's not really part of the story. I don't know even if how known it is. We didn't find too much evidence of this, but we do see here you see in purple the change in serial dependence over time. So we see a change in all experiments, and experiment 2 is messier, but both experiment 1 and experiment 3 show quite a clear increase over time with serial dependence, perhaps as people are becoming more tired. They're relying more on the default mechanisms. And this is the opposite from what we see in the memory measures, which makes sense. As people become more tired, they're probably performing less well in memory, although there's also no connection between the two in terms of the changes over time. They're not correlated. So the results, I think, are interesting, a bit confusing. But first of all, in terms of this question of whether we have a push me, pull you, where when one goes up, the other goes down, we were expecting to see three things if that's the case. Reduced serial dependence at boundaries, similar effects of boundary manipulations, and a correlation between the effects. We do find the first, but we don't find the other two. So I think it's quite clear that at least in this paradigm, we're talking about two different mechanisms. Perhaps if the tasks were different, we could find some, let's say, level of processing. If we measure them both at a similar level of processing, perhaps we'd see more of a link between them. So some of the pieces kind of fit. We have some pieces of the puzzle that are missing, but the main things I found were exciting here are the fact that both boundaries and sensory change reduce serial dependence. That's not trivial. And even less trivial is the fact that with no sensory change at all, just the fact that we know conceptually that a new event has started because we're no longer in the parasol event, we're now in the butterfly event, that already causes reduced serial dependence. Just because we're kind of, we have a different prior about what should be occurring now. And for those more interested in segmentation, this dissociation between segmentation measures that seems to show the temporal order memory is a much more clean measure of segmentation because associative memory seems to be sensitive to change and not to boundaries. And with that, I'd like to thank the lab, especially Shira Boro, who led this project and came up with this idea of connecting the different fields, and Guy Avraham and the two undergraduate students who are in the lab and helped with this. And that's it. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Aya. This was a really interesting talk, and I want to invite everybody to unmute yourself and give Aya a big applaud. And are you happy to take questions?
Of course.
Okay. So I assume that other people may also have questions, but so I will start. I want to ask if you think, I mean, when you managed to really nicely dissociate the event boundary from the perceptual boundary. But do you think this has to do with the fact, so I understand that the participants were trained and I wonder if this is some kind of like top-down modulation, and if in general sensory change does induce event boundaries. So in naturalistic vision, I assume, like you showed in the video with the girl, once she walked in, or the woman, it was evident that something may change, and and clearly that's a sensory change, and I was thinking, okay, what if it was just uh, some river flowing or something else, maybe that wouldn't cause it. So, um, but I'm thinking whether naturalistically or in everyday life, sensory change just is followed nicely, or by a boundary change, and maybe and this is kind of like a cognitive manipulation that manages to dissociate, but maybe. Okay, so yeah, that's one question.
So I think in real life, usually sensory change, it does accompany event boundaries. It doesn't always have to lead to event boundaries. We can think of a lot of situations of things that change kind of in a predictable way that we probably won't even think about and won't cause us to think something is different. Let's say, I don't know, I ride my bike to work. So the view changes all the time, but it's still one event. But certainly, usually, event boundaries will be characterized by sensory change. And this was a very intentional manipulation to try and dissociate those. In real life, I think we can also think of situations where it's the lack of sensory change that could signal a boundary. So, for example, classic example I give is if you try to start your car and it doesn't start, right? If you're expecting something to happen and it doesn't, that can also be quite a salient event boundary.
Yeah.
But those are certainly less common.
So in a way, I'm just following up on your example. It's the breaking of expectation that is kind of like an event boundary, is once, things just don't follow the statistics or anticipation. I'm just,
So that's a huge question in the segmentation literature. What is an event boundary? So according to most of the theoretical models, it's prediction error, but that just doesn't cover it. We can all think of enough situations where there's no prediction error, but there will still be an event boundary. And there are a few studies showing boundary-like effects when there is no prediction error. So the field has yet to figure out what is the cause of boundaries. I relate it to something completely different, like a label that we give to one unit versus another. I think it has to do with how we compress information when we have kind of the end of one segment that we can represent as a unit in a efficient way, and we're now representing something new, either because of prediction error or because of a change in location, let's say, that would likely cause a boundary. But
I
that's not verified.
I mean, it's a huge field. I mean,
Yeah.
we experience it all the time. It's like, how do you dissect our everyday experience? It's just and if there's also internal influences as well as external influences. I'm wondering if you see differences also in RTs. So um, maybe I missed it, but are there, I mean, is this also reflected in response times? Can you see if there was a boundary, even if you don't check for it by, for example, RTs or maybe skin galvanization response? Because I'm just wondering if this would also give some information on top of the just the right or wrong response. And
So usually, depending on the task, you do see a change in reaction time at boundaries. Here it wasn't something we could check the same way because of the orientation task.
Mm.
So in a regular segmentation task, people would maybe say whether the color fits the object or something. Imagine the object in the color and say whether it matches. And then you can look at the reaction time to that. But here we have a delay between the actual boundary, which is when the object occurs, and any response that they give, which is quite later. Plus, there's a lot of noise in the reaction time just due to the orientation. We debated whether to start with a random orientation or start at the middle. We ended up starting in the middle, and then we have the added noise that gives us, I mean, the actual orientation, how much they have to rotate the bar. So we don't see any effects there.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there additional questions? Well, this is really interesting, and I'm sure I'm gonna have to reiterate this in my head. Really interesting, and I hope that we will soon see the accepted paper.
Yeah, should be
Um,
out hopefully.
yeah, I'm crossing my fingers. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. It was really interesting. Again, thank you. And there are a few things in the chat. So Jeremy Wolf said thanks. He had to leave. And Marlene Berman also said very interesting. And Erez Simoni in Hebrew said that it was very interesting. He will be happy to discuss it with you. So, thanks so much. And we are now, this was the last talk for this year, academic year. We'll be back next year with, yeah, exciting. Actually, already we know of a few people who are happy to give talks. So we're expecting a very exciting schedule as well. Thank you so much, Aya. It was a pleasure
Thank you.
having you. And yes, and have normal, sane, peaceful summer.
Thank you very much. Thank
Thank you,
you. Bye.
everybody. Bye.